Hello, this is Connor Dillon, and the presentation is The Influence of Greek Culture and Sports on the Indian Subcontinent. The theory is greatly involves Alexander the Great, and this is a map of his empire from the early 1900s. As you can see, Alexander the Great, he was the son of Philip II of Macedonia. He led his armies east to conquer the Persian Empire in retaliation for the assassination of his father. After defeating Darius III at several different battles, he took over the Persian Empire and conquered the great city Babylon. Well, he didn't just stop. He continued east, and he ended up all the way in northern India, where he stopped around the Ganges River because his army mutinied against him. So he had to return home or else have no soldiers. After Alexander invaded all these new territories, including Egypt, Persia, and India, he started diffusing Greek ideas into these new cultures, as well as accepting a few customs from the locals. Among these were philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, as well as theater and sporting events. So, after Alexander won a great battle or had a victory, he would throw a Dionysian festival that included plays and dancing, and a sporting event that included much of the games from Olympics. Greek theater dealt mainly with three different genres: comedy, drama, and satyr plays. While the history of theater in Greece and throughout the world is a little fuzzy on the origins, they most likely evolved from some kind of religious ceremonies, such as the ones performed by the oracle at Delphi. By the time of Alexander the Great, theater had become more than just about honoring a god. They were also held for entertainment purposes. Some of these events are recognized as the rural and city Dionysia. At the festivals that Alexander the Great threw, on the other hand, they would typically devolve into a large drinking match that was held in the honor of the god Dionysus. Greek theater had several characteristics that were almost unique to them. Among the characteristics were the uses of masks. The mask would help signify what kind of character it was, stuff like that. They would also use different kind of color schemes on the masks, as well as the costumes that would help signify, the social status of the character. This would help in cases of mistaken identity. Two characters could be told apart by the audience, at least, by the color, what kind of clothes the individual was wearing, etc. And they would also use broad gestures while on stage, because quite a few of the people watching were far enough away that the individual performing or the group performing would seem rather small. So they had to use these big broad gestures, or the point wouldn't be made very well. Some of the famous Greek works known throughout the world include Aristotle's The Poetics, a thesis on how theater should be performed, as well as Euripides' Alcestis, a play involving Hercules returning the recently deceased queen to her people back from death, Aristophanes' Lysistrata, which deals with the women of Greece foregoing intercourse with their husbands until the Peloponnesian War is ended, and the only surviving Greek trilogy, Aeschylus's Oresteia, which deals with the end of the curse on the house of Atreus. Now we are going to start looking at the sport that is going to be focused upon in this study, Pancration. It's translated as all powers. It was the premier combat sport of the ancient Greek times, and is referred to today as no holds bar. Well, that was because there were really only two rules. You couldn't bite your opponent, and you couldn't gouge the eyes. Typically, it was held at most, if not all, athletic games. Pancration was a development that brought together boxing and wrestling, and also threw in a few kicks, knees, and elbows. So it wasn't just those two things. It also included new elements that were not seen before. The oldest artifact that depicts pancration is actually a horn that was found in Aegea trade Crete that had been dated back to the 17th century BCE. So it's assumed to have been around for that long, but it's known for sure to have been around for roughly 3,000 years, for sure. Now let me walk through some of the characteristics of pancration. It would begin on the feet, much like boxing or wrestling matches back in ancient times, and you could throw any kind of strike. You could attempt to throw your opponent, and you could take them down in a variety of techniques, including double legs, single legs, trips, punches, and kicks. While standing were both allowed, as were knees and elbows and most other strikes imaginable. However, most fights would end up on the ground, where the better grappler would take control. He would apply a submission hold, which was usually a choke, but you would also see things such as ankle locks, knee bars, arm bars, shoulder locks, and a variety of other holds. And he would continue to apply it with steadily more pressure, if not all at once pressure, that would force the opponent to submit or die. And despite the brutality of the sport, that it definitely is brutal, but deaths were uncommon to most matches. Occasionally, an individual would die because he did not want to disgrace himself or his city-state, but most cases, the sources indicate that the opponent would submit, defeat, and continue on with his life and wait for the next games to get revenge. Now, here are several famous pancrationists. Dioxippus, the Greek who fought a Macedonian soldier named Caraugus during the rule of Alexander the Great. Actually, after they invaded Persia, they fought. The Greeks were happy that their man won. Macedonians, not so much. They planted evidence, and Dioxippus jumped on a sword after leaving a letter written to Alexander the Great. There was also Polydamas of Scotusa. He was extremely strong. However, he died attempting to hold a cave from falling in because, he thought he could stop the earth from shaking. There was also Theogenes of Thasos, or alternatively Theogenes. He was the winner of the 480 BC Olympic Games, as well as the holder of an undefeated streak that included 14,000 boxing, wrestling, and pancration matches. Quite the record right there. Now we will begin to look at the history of Indian theater. Theater in India is generally accepted to have begun around the end of the Vedic period, circa 200 BCE, almost 100 years after Alexander the Great's invasion of northern India. While, like Greece, there were religious festivals and ceremonies with almost theater-like practices, the true beginnings of the art of theater are alluded to in the Sanskrit treatise on grammar, the Mahasabhyasya by Patanjali, which was written around 140 BCE. From this point, it appears Sanskrit drama began to pick up steam, eventually having a golden age of culture, beginning around the early 2nd century up until, 450 CE. Now, here's where it gets fun. The characteristics of early Sanskrit theater, most of what we know about Sanskrit theater actually comes from this treatise on theater called the Natya Sastra. Here's some of the information that I've gathered from this source. Sanskrit plays were characterized by rasas, which were the fundamental mood of the plays. There were 8 of these that included the erotic, the comic, pathetic, furious, heroic, terrible, odious, and marvelous. To reach this overall fundamental mood of the play, actors and actresses would use bhavas, which there were 8 that matched up perfectly with the rasas: pleasure, mirth, sorrow, wrath, vigor, fear, disgust, and wonder. And they wouldn't just use the bhavas, they would also use 33 different transitory emotional states, as well as 8 character dispositions. These would all work with the makeup, the costume, movements, and any words or songs to reach the appropriate rasa for the play. Just like Greek theater, there is plenty of famous Sanskrit literature. Among these are the Mahabharata, which is attributed to Vyasa, the Ramayana, which is ascribed to Valmiki, the Natya Sastra, which is translated as the art of theater. It was attributed to Bharata. The Little Clay Cart by King Sudraka, and the Vision of Vasavadatta by Basa. Some of these individuals, including Vyasa, Valmiki, and King Sudraka, are sometimes considered to be mythological or made-up characters, and sometimes these works are thought to be composed of writings from various authors. Now we will look at the Indian side of the sporting techniques, Malayuddha. It's translated directly as boxing match, but it wasn't really boxing match. Instead, the term referred to any particular prize fighting event. It was first used in the Mahabharata, which was the Indian equivalent of the Iliad. It was used to describe a fight between Bhima and Jarasandha, a king and a devotee to the Hindu god of Shiva. They reportedly fought for 27 days before Bhima was able to tear Jarasandha in half and throw his 2 body parts in opposite directions, because that was the only way to kill him. Most sources have indicated that Malayuddha actually had 2 separate forms: a sporting form, which is still around today, called Malakra, and Malayuddha, which was a combat wrestling form where anything went, which included various chokeholds, the use of pressure points, and joint locks. Unfortunately, Malayuddha, as it originally is described in the Mahabharata, no longer exists. It has, however, been the basis for several other martial arts, including Nabam and Pehlwani wrestling, which we will use as examples for the ground fighting of Malayuddha. Here's some background on Pehlwani. The athletes involved were very much like the Malayuddha wrestlers from ancient times. They abstained from the use of tobacco, alcohol, and sex, as well as having a diet that is remarkably similar to the ancient wrestlers. More recent history about Pehlwani from the early 1900s to around the 1960s shows a boom of popularity internationally, as famous wrestlers across the world, such as Karl Gotch, came to train with the Pehlwani wrestlers to improve their overall wrestling game. And just like what we had to do with the grappling, I will use another martial art that is partially based on Malayuddha as a stand-in for the striking portion. I've as a little background to this choice, I throughout some of the sources that I read, there were hints, and they also mentioned numerous things such as head, butts, kicks, elbows, knees, punches. So I would look through the sports, and only one martial art I could find that involved the use of full-on headbutts, which was lethwai, or Burmese boxing, as I like to call it. It's an extremely brutal, full-contact martial art. Headbutts, like I said, head kicks, and even deaths were common at the beginning of the sport. However, a individual, Kiar Ba Nyan, a participant of the 1952 Olympics in boxing, organized rule sets, weight classes, and began regulating it. Later on, the Myanmar government got involved and tried to package lethwai in a different manner than it previously had been. Now, since Mala Yuddha as the all strikes and submission form no longer exists, the historical depictions remind me very much of the early Pancrase hybrid wrestling matches from the 90s. Now, mixing together the three sports that I've mentioned, Pehawani, Lethwai, and Pancrase hybrid wrestling, what follows is a description of what I believe a Mala Yuddha match from ancient times would look like, based on the sources and these three sports. A wrestler would challenge another, or be chosen at random to wrestle by someone of high authority. At the beginning of the fight, one would see a similarity to Pancrase and Lethwai, where punches, knees, kicks would be thrown at each other before eventually tying up in a clinch, in the manner of the ancient Greeks and Pehawanis, with one hand on the back of the neck and one hand on the back of the arm. From this close range, you would most likely see an elbow or two, quite possibly headbutts, since the heads are so close together. But you most likely would not see any knees or kicks being thrown, simply because a wrestler would not want to be taken down and put at a disadvantage on the ground from his back. After a certain amount of time grappling in a clinch, one of the wrestlers would shoot in for a takedown, or go for a trip or a throw. If it succeeds, from there the ground battle would see the wrestler on top seek a submission hold, most likely a choke, or even a ankle lock or a knee bar of some kind, while the opponent would attempt to defend from all these holds, possibly reverse position, and even stand up and continue fighting from the top. After grappling very hard, one of the wrestlers would eventually be able to latch onto a hold and force his opponent to admit defeat by tapping out, screaming in pain, etc. Now we are going to compare and contrast Greek and Indian theater. Alexander the Great is known to have thrown festivals in honor of the god Dionysus, the patron god of theater, during his conquests in India that ended around 325 BCE. In comparison, Sanskrit theater for sure began sometime around 200 BCE, over 100 years later. Greek theaters, the buildings were built in naturally ideal locations, such as the hillsides, while the Indian theaters were built to be freestanding, with the auditorium shaped like a cave in order to improve acoustics. Greek theater only had three genres: drama, comedy, and satyr plays, while the Indian theater had 8 rasas, but the actors would be able to portray around 49 different emotional states, in a sense, to promote that main rasa. Greek and Indian theater both use color heavily to signify different social statuses, and even in the architecture of the Indian theaters, there would be 4 pillars with different colors to show seating arrangements as well as the different castes of the Hindu system. Um, and both Indian and Greek theater, the stories would usually deal with mythology, or even sometimes tell history of India or Greece, as well as promote and create new stories. However, Indian theater would have a short description at the beginning that would describe the time, the place, and the situation, unlike Greek theater. Now, when comparing the sporting aspect of this study, Pancration and Malayuddha, one simply has to look at the timeline of events. Alexander the Great's invasion of India began in 327 BCE and ended 2 years later, 325 BCE. Now, the term Malayuddha was first used in the Mahabharata, which was written around 300 BCE, roughly 27 years after Alexander's invasion first began. Now, with that said, both martial arts had very, very similar game plans, you could say. Fighters were both trained and versed in fighting while standing up using kicks, knees, punches, and elbows. However, Malayuddha would also use more abstract strikes such as headbutts. And then after a striking portion of the bout, a takedown, trip, or throw would be attempted where the fighters would land on the ground and continue from there with striking or grappling, looking for submissions. And then eventually a submission or knockout would occur and a victor would be declared. Now, Malayuddha had more deaths than Pancration. Possibly it could be because Malayuddha would also include weapons if a challenged individual so felt like using one. But it's most likely just that submission hold would be latched onto and an opponent just simply would not give up and he would die from said submission hold or would suffer a knockout that was quite vicious and die later of brain injuries. Now, what this slide shows here are several different notes that I thought would be very interesting for read. Xenophon, the general in charge of the March of the 10,000 back from Persia to Greece, he mentioned Greek soldiers performing sword dances, which would be to show their physical prowess and whatnot. So from there, the locals could see that possibly as the beginning of katas, which are prearranged motions that would supposedly help with technique. He also broke down the differences on views between athletics from the Greeks and the Persians. And then Plato, he was my source regarding leather wraps around Pancrationists and boxers' hands. And also, like I said earlier, Malayuddha contest weapons could be involved if a challenged individual felt like it. Oh, and another little interesting note regarding Malayuddha, it was actually phased out because the Mughals rulers during the 17th century favored this newer, more Persian form of wrestling, Pehlwani. Now, that said, the training regimes and the diets are almost exactly the same between ancient Malayuddha and the Pehlwani wrestlers from today.